Hello, friends. I'm excited to share with you a little bit of a few thoughts about Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11, which is the Old Testament reading for the first week of the season of Lent. Before we get into the passage itself, I want to provide some context here of where this passage is occurring and about the book of Deuteronomy as a whole. And so you can see some of that right over here in this area of what I want to talk about there. That first of all, it's important to sort of know something about the book of Deuteronomy as a whole and kind of how it's functioning. That Deuteronomy, in many ways, is framed as a kind of farewell speech for Moses. So when you think about where this book occurs in the biblical canon, that actually makes sense, right? That in the biblical story, the people have already been delivered from Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've been wandering through the wilderness. And in the biblical narrative, the book of Deuteronomy is poised in this moment of transition, that the people of Israel are on the edge of the promised land, right? If you think all the way back to the story of Abraham, God had made that promise to Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation and that they would have a land of their own, essentially the land of Canaan. And the people are poised to enter into that land. And right as they're about to enter in, Moses gives this kind of final admonition, which is the book of Deuteronomy. You may remember that in the book of Numbers, uh, God says that Moses and Aaron will not be allowed to enter the land. And in fact, that whole generation that wandered through the wilderness is not allowed to enter into the land. But their children are about to enter in. And so Moses gives this kind of final speech. It's sort of reminding uh, the Israelites of everything that God has done for them. And not only what God has done for them, but also the covenant that God has called them into. And so that actually is, Deuteronomy is very appropriately named because it is essentially a retelling of the laws that you get in the second half of the book of Exodus, throughout the book of Leviticus, some of the book of Numbers. And that is essentially what the word Deuteronomy means. Deutero meaning second, nomos being the Greek word for law. And so this book is a kind of second law. It's Moses retelling the law, reminding people of the law, and reminding them of the covenant that they've made as they're about to enter into this new phase of that covenant and as they stand on the edge of the promised land. So that's a little bit about just the book of Deuteronomy as a whole and where it fits into the biblical story. Interestingly, the if you look at this section here, you'll see that this particular passage in the book of Deuteronomy also comes at a moment of transition in the book of a whole. So I've provided kind of a short little outline, a very simple outline of the book, or at least this is one way of approaching the book, that the book opens with some of the events at Sinai, and then in chapters 12 through 26, specifically 26 verse 15, you have this reading or retelling of the law. And then after that is this sort of sealing of the covenant, and then the book ends with sort of blessings and curses, which is actually a major piece of the theology of the book of Deuteronomy. The idea that if you follow God's commands, that then you'll be blessed, and if you don't, then you'll be cursed. And so it's sort of fitting that the book ends with those blessings and curses. But I would just have us notice here, you see that I have the passage from Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11, which is the text for this week in Lent. But you'll notice that, uh, as I said in the outline here, that passage comes near the end of this whole, what is really the central section of the book, right? This is coming at the end of this retelling of the law. And in fact, if you look there at just the verses that follow, Deuteronomy 26, 16 to 19, you can see that there's this sort of sealing of the covenant, right? So it says, "This very day the Lord your God is commanding you to observe these statutes and ordinances," the ones that they've been talking about for the last 14 chapters. So observe them diligently with all your heart and with all your soul. Today you have obtained the Lord's agreement to be your God and for you to walk in his ways, right? So there's that covenant, right? God is going to be their God, and they're going to walk in his ways to keep his statutes, his commandments, and his ordinances, and to obey him. Today the Lord has obtained your agreement to be his treasured people, as he promised you, and to keep all his commandments, for him to set you high above all nations that he has made, in praise and in fame and in honor, and for you to be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he promised. So we see that this sort of concludes a section of Deuteronomy where the covenant has been made, or the covenant has been ratified or renewed, however you want to say it, that there is this covenant between God and the people. And so this passage, I'm going to read the passage in just a moment, but again, in just providing some context, this passage in Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11, is actually a great text to engage with at the beginning of a new season, at the beginning of this season of Lent, because it exists at sort of multiple intersections of transition, right? That we're beginning a new season in the church year, in the season of Lent, but this text reminds us of a number of important elements as we begin that new season, just by virtue of where it lands in the biblical story, right? Because Deuteronomy is happening at this moment of transition as the people are about to enter the land, and Moses is reminding them of their covenant at that moment, that crossroads moment, right? Like they're about to enter into the land, and it's sort of like, hey, don't forget what God has done. Don't forget the covenant that you have agreed to, and let's renew that covenant here, which is a really appropriate sort of word for the beginning of the season of Lent, in which that's kind of we're doing the same thing, right? We're beginning this new season, and this season is about reminding us of the covenant that God has made with us through Jesus Christ. So I'll say more about that in a little bit, but let's get into the text itself. All right, so Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, so see, we're right on the edge of the land there, right? They're ready to enter into the promised land. To possess, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And you shall put it in a basket and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, Today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. When the priest takes the basket from your hands and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. Okay, so before we get into this piece, I just want to say something really quickly here. So again, the scene is they're entering into the land. It seems like at this point they've been in the land long enough to have a harvest, right? So they're the very first harvest. They're bringing the first fruits of that harvest and bringing it to the priest and making an offering to God as a sort of acknowledgement that God has brought them into this land. So there's this action that takes place to acknowledge the covenant, acknowledge what God has done. But then this next piece is really interesting because it's a sort of recounting of the story, uh, almost like a creed, right? Almost a reminder of like, hey, this is who I am as part of the people of God. This is who we are as the people of God. So as they bring this offering, and as they offer to the priest, and the priest takes the basket, the person making the offering is supposed to say uh, what we have right here: a wandering, oh, sorry, there we go. A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor, right? Um, there's this acknowledgement that the people of God were sort of nobody, right? They were just wandering migrants without a home. And it says, a wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. You shall, and so then that ends the sort of creed, right? Like the sort of telling of the story. And it says, you shall set it down before the Lord your God and bow down before the Lord your God. Then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord your God has given to you and to your house. So I just actually find this text pretty fascinating, right? And actually really, as I already said, useful for the beginning of the season of Lent, but also just useful in thinking about how we think about our own identity as part of the people of God, right? That one of the first things that the people are to do when they enter into this land is to bring an offering, and as they bring that offering, they sort of retell their story as the people of God, right? That our father Abraham was a wandering migrant who didn't have a land, didn't have any place to call home, and his ancestors went down into Egypt, right? And it retells the whole story of the Exodus, that the people were oppressed in Egypt, that they were aliens, they were strangers, sojourners, immigrants, whatever word you want to use to capture that idea, that they were strangers in a foreign land, right? And that they were being oppressed, as so often strangers in a foreign land are often vulnerable and marginalized. And God heard their cry and acted on their behalf and brought them out and really made them into a people. That prior to that, they weren't really a people, but God made them into a people. And so as the people bring this offering in the new land, it's this sort of reminder, right? So that they are coming into this land that is not theirs, that is not their own, but that God promised to their ancestor long before. But it's this reminder, actually a reminder we get a lot in the book of Deuteronomy, that says, hey, remember you were once strangers and foreigners. So even though now you may have a home, God has given you this land to live in, Deuteronomy will repeatedly reminds the people of God, hey, you're the only reason you're not a stranger, an alien, an immigrant is because God acted on your behalf and gave you a land. But remember that before that you were. And so because of that, you're supposed to treat strangers, aliens, immigrants with kindness, remembering that you were that once too. And it would be sort of the height of hypocrisy for Israel to not keep that in mind. So I think there's a number of key ideas that really this passage helps us explore at the beginning of the season of Lent. And one is that it reminds us of the importance of covenant at the beginning of this season when we're thinking about our covenant with Jesus, right? The season of Lent is all about being reminded of Jesus' journey towards the cross and ultimately his suffering and death during Holy Week, and then ultimately his resurrection in the Easter season, and that all of that is our means, especially as Gentiles, as non-Jews, our means of entering into the kind of covenant that this passage is talking about with God. And so this passage reminds us of that covenant right here at the beginning of this season of Lent. It also reminds us that at the heart of that covenant is the story of God's redemptive work, right? That again, we were all foreigners, aliens. You can think about that passage in Ephesians, right? You once were far off, strangers to the promises of God, right? But now you have been brought near by the blood of Christ. That all of us were foreigners or aliens until God acted on our behalf. And that's this sort of creed or this retelling of the story that we have in the Deuteronomy passage reminds us of the importance of retelling that story to remind us of who we are, who we were until God acted on our behalf, and now who we are because God has acted on our behalf. But it's not just the telling of the story. That telling of the story is also paired with action. In other words, the people don't just sort of remind themselves, oh yeah, this is what God did and this is who we are, but they perform a concrete action. They bring an offering of the very first fruits of the harvest, right? That reminds them in a very concrete, physical way that the land is not theirs, and that they are not, God doesn't owe them prosperity, right? But that the bringing of this offering is a reminder that God has acted on their behalf to provide this land and to provide this crop for them and to continue to bless them. And I think that's really appropriate as we begin the season of Lent, because in Lent, uh, you'll often hear people talk about like giving something up for Lent, right? Like somebody might give up chocolate, or I often give up soda because I'm hopelessly addicted to it. Um, but that physical act is meant to be a sort of reminder of a spiritual reality, of our dependence on God, of the ways that God has provided for us, and also that very small, almost insignificant sacrifice in a lot of cases reminds us of Jesus' really major and significant sacrifice on our behalf. So there's an embodiedness to it, that it's not just retelling the story, but retelling the story paired with an action. And so Lent is a time to engage in practices that remind us of the covenant we have joined by God's redemptive acts in Jesus Christ. And so I think this passage from Deuteronomy gives us a lot of opportunity to explore those kinds of ideas right here at the beginning of the season of Lent.